misgiving, but she didn't want to speak up. After all, their fortunes had obviously taken a turn for the better. While Laurent's children waited at the cottage, he steadily made his way to the port city, filled with anticipation of reclaiming his wealth and status. It was true, of course, that he had still suffered heavy losses. However, with the cargo in this ship, he could seed a new business, perhaps building up to a new fleet of ships. His head was filled with dreams of the spices, silks, and other goods he might import in the future. It was devastating to him, therefore, to arrive and find his dreams dashed. It was true, his ship had reappeared with most of its cargo unharmed. However, word had spread quickly of his good fortune, and his many creditors had taken swift action. By the time Laurent had come to claim his property, it had already been distributed to pay his many debts. In vain, he contacted one merchant after another, asking for an extension on his considerable bills. But it was no use. At the end of the day, he was a man without debts, but he was empty-handed. There was no money left for him to invest, and there was certainly no money to spend on the gifts he had promised to his family. He was so disheartened, he didn't even want to stay in the city overnight. Without properly provisioning himself, considering the weather, or sending any correspondence ahead of him, Laurent mounted his tired horse again and rode out of town, heading back down the provincial road that had brought him to the port that morning. Laurent was a few hours outside of the city when darkness fell and a storm descended. Lightning and thunder crashed all around him, and the wind gusted mercilessly, blowing limbs off the trees. Laurent's horse became frightened and bolted away from the main road, taking him into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late that he had been foolish to undertake this nighttime journey, Laurent began searching in the gusting wind for any sort of shelter, such as a cave. How long his horse wandered through the howling gale, he did not know. Finally, he saw a tall stone wall arise before him. He urged the horse onward, hoping he had reached a house where he might shelter. Arriving at the forbidding wall of rock, he saw that it was not a house. It was the wall around an estate. A tall and imposing iron gate stood ever so slightly open. Having no time for good manners, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy swinging gate wide enough to pull his horse through. Together, they slowly headed up a paved walkway that receded ahead of them into the swirling darkness. With leaves flying all around and rain pelting him from all sides, Laurent could barely see the massive structure that emerged ahead of him in the wicked gloom. It was a mansion, to be sure. Although his visibility was limited, he could see it had a grand approach and many large rooms with tall windows. It was a very intimidating place for a person to arrive uninvited but he had no choice. He feared he could not survive the night without a roof over his head. Tying his horse up safely in a sheltered alcove, he walked to the massive front door and lifted the iron door knocker. He let it fall, hearing the sound echo through the gloom, as if in response to the thunder. When there was no answer, he took a deep breath and pushed the door inward with all his weight. It gave, and he found himself almost falling onto the floor of a grand entryway. Laurent lay on the cold flagstones for a moment, regaining his breath in the eerie stillness. He could still hear the rain lashing the front steps through the crack in the tall door, and thought to himself how glad he was that he'd found shelter for his horse. Rising in the semi-darkness, he peered about him. He was in a grand reception area with a curved staircase ascending on either side. Suits of armor stood sentinel here and there. Ahead of him there was a set of richly carved double doors. The silence inside the house was profound. He could have heard a pin drop, but there was a light glowing around the cracks of the doors in front of him. After a few half-hearted efforts to call out to the occupants, he took another deep breath and walked toward the lighted room. Pushing the doors slowly open, he leaned inside and scanned the room. A fire was roaring in the cavernous hearth. In front of it, a table was set for one, with a few simple dishes, a carafe, and a large drinking glass spread across it. His gaze took in the other aspects of the comfortable room. He saw upholstered chairs and tables carelessly stacked with books. Still, there was no sign of the owner. Laurent awkwardly sat down on one of the armchairs and waited for a few moments. Soon, he could not take his eyes from the simple dinner laid upon the table. The loaf of bread and the aroma of the roasted meat tormented him, and his stomach growled loudly. As minutes passed and nobody appeared, he soon gave in to his hunger and seated himself at the table. First, taking just a slice of bread, and then slowly eating the entire meal, he passed an hour in contented silence. Perhaps, he thought, the owner was away from home and sheltering from the storm elsewhere. Taking a deep drink of the delicious liquid in the glass, he hungrily polished off the rest of the dinner. Yes, he told himself, the owner was away, and he would be able to explain himself in the morning. Upon finishing all the food, Laurent leaned happily back in his chair and drank the rest of the contents of the carafe. The fire danced before his eyes, crackling and popping with a comforting warmth. Draining the last drop from his large cup, he pulled the letter about his recovered cargo ship from his pocket. Just a short time ago, he had been so full of hope. Now, those dreams were gone again. He dropped the letter on the table and pushed it away. Without even realizing it, Laurent fell into a deep sleep.